Hello, I'm Richard Bradley from Midlands Connect, and I'm your chair for this panel session on the challenges of urgently delivering alternative fuels to meet regional needs. This session is about sharing the great work and successes of the subnational transport bodies. We're using Slido again to gather questions from the audience. Again, as I said before in the previous session, if you can download the app and run it from the app, is probably the best way to do it. The event code for this room is SDBC23. And we've got Dan at the front here who's actually pulling all together all the questions and everything. We'll send them up to me. The transport sector has the highest carbon emissions, has become a key focus in the race to tackle rising global temperatures. The panellists will discuss their roles in finding the best access to alternatives to fossil fuels and finding land at the right locations for the infrastructure. The panellists will discuss how they are working with partners to speed up the rollout of refuelling and recharging facilities and help deal with the hardest challenges. This includes building public electric vehicle charging for all our communities and geographies and a national network for refuelling and recharging hubs for goods vehicles. I'll invite the panellists one at a time up to the lectern to speak on their theme within this subject. And if you could please send any questions through on Slido, Dan will moderate them and log them in for us. If we don't manage to answer the Slidos, we'll have to see how we get on today in this session. We'll speak to meeting the minds and get back to you at a later point, hopefully. So, our first panellist is James White. Is the technical lead at Western Gateway. James works across a range of work areas, including alternative fuels for freight, rural mobility, rail, and the Western Gateway's long-term strategic transport plan. James, how can we provide the best access to land and energy to refuel and recharge the goods vehicle network?
Right. Well, thank you, Richard. Yeah, so I'm James White from the Western Gateway Subnational Transport Body. And yes, on that whole issue about what can we do to help provide facilities for goods vehicles, to encourage the take-up of electric vehicle charging and hydrogen refuelling. And I hope it's going to work. It does indeed work. Right, so what we've been doing very recently, this is a joint piece of work with the Peninsula Transport STB, is we've been looking at that whole issue. And we've very much drawn on the work that's been undertaken previously by Midlands Connect, and very grateful to Midlands Connect for allowing us to do this, using the approach that they've been developing since 2019. And late last year, we published the first draft of our own alternative fuels for freight strategy. And it's also a methodology that's now been picked up by the other STBs as well. There's 4 principal elements to the work that we've been doing. I'm not going to go into them in detail, not really going to touch on the policy side or the stakeholder engagement, but I'm just going to focus more on that future forecasting for fuels. What's the future demand likely to be? And then translating that into what sort of network of hydrogen refueling and EV charging stations are we going to need to provide. So just taking that first element in terms of the forecasting side, our consultants, Atkins and Cenex, they used their very deep industry knowledge. They looked at future trends, and they came up with a bespoke model to try and forecast what's the likely take-up going to be for alternative fuels for freight. And you can see on the right-hand side is the high uptake scenario. So this is the optimistic scenario, and under that, the prediction is that diesels go from being the dominant form of power, really almost to the point by 2050 that they've ceased to be around at all. And with a sort of fairly equal share between hydrogen-powered and electric vehicle-powered. On the other side of the screen is the lower forecast, and this is perhaps very pessimistic. But if those trends don't happen, you're likely to see something like this, where diesel-powered engines are still very, very dominant, and there's a very small share for hydrogen, electric vehicle, and not forgetting biofuels as well, and plug-in hybrids. So there was a range of scenarios looked at in terms of forecasting. And then our consultants took those forecasts and modelled how a future network of refuelling and recharging stations could look like. And they came up with this map here. It covers the geography of the Western Gateway and the peninsula. It's largely based on the strategic road network with sites within 5 kilometres of the strategic road network, 5 kilometres being probably the largest distance operators will detour off to go and get refueled or recharged. But we had a bit of an issue with this map. The Western Gateway and Peninsula, we are largely a rural area, which came out very strongly in one of the earlier panel sessions on rural mobility. And one glance at this map, and you can see that actually there are some fairly hefty gaps in the potential network. If you're living in North Devon or North Cornwall, there isn't much there. Dorset, north-south routes, again, a bit of a gap. Wiltshire as well. And even along the coast with Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, a lack of provision for potential sites for alternative fuels for freight. Now, the methodology used worked extremely well with Midlands Connect. They come up with their network. But clearly, with a very rural-based area, that methodology wasn't quite working so well. So we had to look again at this, and we asked our consultants to have a rethink on what this network could look like. And this is what they came up with. They took more of a zonal approach. And there's 3 types of zone on this map. At the core of it, you see the green circles, which I hope you can just about make out. These are the existing truck stops along the strategic road network. So it's fairly similar to the map on the slide I've just shown you. And then there's a zone around of about 20 kilometres around those particular truck stops. They're mostly on that strategic road network. But then the consultants, they looked at the potential for other, more multimodal sites. And in particular, they were looking at areas where there's a particular focus on road freight employment. And use the criteria of if there's more than 50 people on a particular site, that's a potential location to have an EV charging point and a hydrogen refueling point. And by looking at those freight employment centres, and these are the red spots on the map, you get a far better coverage of potential refueling stations across our collective geography. But it did still leave gaps. So there was then a need for a third zonal approach. And these are the pink triangles, which I hope you'll be able to see on the map. And these are actually indicative. These aren't specific sites, but it's really flagging up the fact that in those particular areas, there is going to be a need for at least one recharging or refueling facility. And some areas, you've got 2 pink triangles. That's just to say that there's probably going to be a need for 2 or more refueling and recharging sites. So taking this more zonal-based approach and focusing on employment sites as well as truck stops and these indicative sites, the coverage is pretty good. So we've moved well away from that problem where we're going to have a network which actually, frankly, didn't serve a large chunk of our geography to a potential future network that will serve our geography. Yes, you will spot that there are still some gaps there. Those gaps are mainly places like Salisbury Plain, Exmoor, Dartmoor and Bodmin Moor. So maybe not huge demand in those areas, but that's not to ignore the fact that we do need to serve our rural areas as best as we can. So that's where we've got to in terms of our network. The next steps on from that are to take that, what is now essentially a very long list of potential sites and go through a shortlisting process. And we're being helped here by Midlands Connect, who had some additional capability and capacity funding from the Department for Transport to develop a forecasting tool for the STBs to use. This is just about to become available for all of us to do. That's what the slide on the right-hand side, picture on the right-hand slide is a couple of screenshots from. And when we've gone through that shortlisting process, then I think comes the really challenging bit. We've got to start developing the business case for those selected sites from the shortlist, working with the industry and with our local authorities to try and help facilitate bringing forward some of these sites. And then the third picture on that slide is just one of the recommendations that's coming out of the revised alternative fuels for freight strategy. And this is about the role that agriculture can play. Agriculture is rapidly greening, and is there scope here for farm-based refueling hubs? And it wouldn't just be for the freight industry. This could be fueling hubs for the wider rural community as well, which again overlaps those of you who might have been in the rural mobility session before lunch. It very much links into that as well. That this is integrated thinking and planning for the future. So we've got a long way to go in the Western Gateway and Peninsula, but I think this is quite an exciting moment where we're starting to really develop the ideas around how can we provide that network for the freight industry.
Thanks, James. If you could just stay at the podium for a second, I've got a question for you. I mean, it's great hearing you talk about that hierarchy of hubs, from a national long haul to a strategic and more regional short haul to local delivery. You've talked about using attributes around land and energy and using the pass-by forecasts of the fleets for helping find the best locations. We have a challenge that we're trying to take a telescopic view of the island of Great Britain as well, with those modes that travel around, moving those heavy goods over long distances. How do you think that might change your view? Because you've got some of the most challenging geographies down there in the southwest, and where would you put your money on for the transport mode and the fuel type?
Right. Yeah. I think in terms of transport mode, I think I'm probably going to hedge my bets here a bit. I think HGVs, they are the backbone of the logistics industry. So I think in terms of their role in the future, they're still going to have an enormous role to play. But having said that, we need to develop other alternatives, particularly rail freight. I mean, you would have heard the Minister this morning talking about the importance of rail freight, and some work that the Western Gateway and the Peninsula are doing at the moment is looking at a range of intermodal freight terminal sites. So bringing freight in longer distance into our region for local delivery, be it by HGV or smaller vehicle or electric-powered vehicle. There's also e-cargo bike trials going on in Plymouth and also in Bristol. So I think it's going to need to be a real mixture. There's not going to be one silver bullet mode that's going to solve the whole issue. But in terms of fuel, that's almost a sort of million-dollar question in a way, because you'll have seen from my slides about the forecasting with sort of a fairly equal share between hydrogen and electric. And I think this is where there is this dilemma in a way that are we going to head towards having a sort of duality of alternative fuels, or should we be really focusing on one rather than the other? In some respects, the Department for Transport has been very helpful in setting the direction of travel, but we do need to decarbonise that. Diesel-powered HGVs are going to be, you can't sell them beyond, 2035? Or, 35. So we know where we've got to go, but how do we actually get there? And I think that's where we're lacking perhaps a steer from central government to say we should be looking at EV charging, or we should be looking at hydrogen charging. So I think there is a risk here that we're going to end up with a bit of a fudge between the two modes. And if you're a fleet operator, just as an example, and you're wanting to invest potentially millions and millions of pounds in doing a new fleet, you really want to know what's the fuel of the future. And at the moment, we're sort of going parallel with two fuels. So I think, Richard, all I can say really in terms of my prediction is, for the time being at least, we're going to be heading with two predominant types of alternative fuels for the future.
Okay, thank you, James. Thank you. So we've now got our second panellist, who's Suzanne Buck, and Suzanne is the Technical Programme Manager at Transport East. Suzanne joined Transport East in 2021 from Suffolk County Council, where she led the Strategic Transport and Policy team. Susan now leads the development and delivery of a diverse technical work programme to inform the delivery of Transport East's strategy and investment priorities. Suzanne, I expect you've seen many challenges from your county experience to the regional viewpoint. What are the key challenges you're seeing for switching to electric vehicles?
Thank you, Richard. First of all, I just wanted to start off, Richard's done my introduction for me, is just to really talk about Transport East. So as a region, it's that bulge on the eastern side of the country. And it's a really diverse region. Key characteristics include 500 miles of coastline, which have 13 ports, 2 of which are free ports. And also, a third of our population live in rural areas. We have large rural areas. And it's these two aspects of our geography that really drives 42% of our emissions coming from transport. So freight has been covered kindly by James. So rural, and I think you've probably heard this in other presentations, the issue is really around car dependency, lack of access to sustainable transport, and therefore alternative fuels for those communities and switching to EVs in particular is going to be important if we're going to solve the rural emission problem. Whereas James focused on freight, I will be looking at a shift for EVs to by car. So shift to EV is sort of the backbone of the plan to decarbonise transport. It's seen as the path of least resistance. Quite easy, people just switch a vehicle, no real change to behaviour. However, you may have seen there's been some press articles recently about a reluctance of people to switch to EVs, and even people switching from EVs back to traditional fuel vehicles, citing lack of charging infrastructure as the reason for that. So why is this the case? We know local authorities are very keen to deliver charging infrastructure, so are CPOs, who also many of them have significant financial backing. So why is it so slow? So what I'm going to do is, there's 3 pieces of work which have been done by STBs over the last year, and I'm just going to use those to start to pull out some of those challenges. And those challenges relate to what infrastructure and where, what are the barriers to delivery, and then behaviour. And again, if you were in the decarb presentation before lunch, you would have heard a lot of discussion about behaviour and understanding how people do what and why they do what they do. Now, it's going to be very high level, but if you find it interesting, which I hope you will, there will be links available to all of these reports and documents on the STB conference website by the end of the week. So first, what infrastructure and where? So Transport East, with England's Economic Heartland, commissioned WSP to develop their EV Ready tool to apply across our regions. And this is work that's currently being expanded out to cover Western Gateway and Peninsula Transport in the same way as we are picking up on the alternative fuel for freight. And what that will do will provide a consistent approach to assessing EV demand and charge point requirements from the very eastern point of England down to the most southwest point, sorry. So the tool, in brief, and this will be very brief because it can get quite technical, it's based on certain flows. It has a comprehensive baseline which considers not only current EV ownership, charge points, also grid capacity, the need for on-street parking, and they use that as the base to then start to look at actually what's the forecast. How are we going to know how much or how quickly the EV take-up's going to be? So they've looked at sales, historic sales, and future industry forecast, and then developed a high and a low take-up scenario. A bit like, again, with fuel for freight. We need to understand the envelope that we're working within. And WSP developed this from the future energy scenarios. The model then develops an assessment of the location of demand. Where will that EV take-up happen? And then where would the most effective or attractive location be for those charge points? So this considers standard and rapid charging. You won't be surprised to hear that rapid is basically strategic and major road network, and standard is the rest of the region. And it considers a number of factors, but ultimately it seems to reflect the likely return on investment. And the output from this is a Power BI dashboard, which enables our local authorities to look across their area into neighbouring authorities as well by year to see what the demand and location of that demand would be. So the image on the left is just like the Transport East summary page, and I put it on there really just to demonstrate the scale. So at the moment, well, as of April 2022, there were 1,037 public charging points. In 2 years' time, that theoretically needs to go up to a minimum of 7,400 or even 11,500. Huge, significant leap in infrastructure. And then by 2030, so when they stop the sale of ICE vehicles, that again needs to increase up to over 14,500. And the importance of the 2030 is that at that point, those ICE vehicles will still persist beyond 2040 because the average age of scrappage for vehicles is about 13 years. So it is going to be a long-term impact. The two images on the right, the top one shows you the level of demand for EV charging based on 2030 with a high scenario uptake. And the lower one shows the locations recommended for charge points. And the reason that I picked this, and again, it's a common theme that I've seen across this conference, is the challenge in rural areas. And it highlights the unmet demand that could happen if you take this very commercial approach. And the challenge is around making the case for investment in areas such as this. But this is a model and a tool, and what we would hope is that local authorities would utilise this information to look to how they could develop delivery strategies so that they do include these rural areas, which, as I said at the beginning of my talk, is the area that produces a lot of our emissions in Transport East region. The next piece of work was around barriers. And again, as a joint piece of work with England's Economic Heartland, we commissioned City Science to undertake an EV insight study, ELVIS for short. You will soon learn that Transport East enjoys naming their models and reports. So this looks at the current state of EV infrastructure deployment, EV strategy development, and has identified gaps and barriers to the delivery of EV infrastructure. It's a comprehensive engagement program. They had workshops and surveys with local authorities. They also had surveys with other organisations like Visit East of England, one-to-one discussions with CPOs and DNOs across the two regions, and also a desktop review of the EV sector investment and growth potential. So a lot of work was done, and lots of words have been pulled out in that word cloud, but really the top challenges that were brought forward from this work related to resource, particularly for local authorities, but also, as I heard in a recent meeting, for CPOs as well. And what this is around is that there are some particular skills that are needed to deliver, both in local authorities and CPOs. But with the current funding and approach, everyone's trying to recruit the same skills at the same time, and there just isn't the supply for that. Second issue, which is a key issue for CPOs, is land availability. And you can see there should be a quick win on this because local authorities not only own land, but they're, through the planning process, are able to facilitate the use of land. Procurement is another issue, and Barrett will be picking up on this in a moment. But the lack of resource but expertise is a challenge. Working at a small scale and then the expertise, nervousness about doing the right thing can put quite restrictive requirements on the CPOs as part of those contracts. Local authorities are under immense pressure to deliver. And then the other area which I've just picked on previously is around rural, the fact it's not really economically attractive. So this work really highlights, now if you're interested in getting a good insight into where the industry is at the moment, I recommend having a look at this report. It highlights the need for capability, capacity support to enable local authorities to actually deliver fast and effectively. Oh, no. go back. Right, so the other one, behaviour on the right-hand side. So this applies to, what's people's behaviour in switching to EVs, charging EVs, driving EVs. Last year, Transport East commissioned Arup to develop its behaviour and transport impact and equity model. Bertie, I did warn you. It's an ABM model, and it generates a synthetic population across our region with all the attributes of the different types of people within our region. And then it assessed a number of scenarios, including different road pricing levels, increase in active travel, different levels of EV uptake, and then it combined those. And it assessed how that affected individuals, how it affected emissions, equity, for example. So within this model, the agent tries to optimize its transport choices to complete its daily activities. And it does this a number of times until it settles on what is the most efficient way of doing that. So it's effectively a multimodal approach. It looks at linked trips. It also considers things that you wouldn't get a bus to work if there isn't a bus that then will get you home, for example. And it also looks at complexity of people's lives, the fact that you don't just do singular trips, you often chain them together. So the model has a 2040 baseline, which was, for an EV perspective, was based around 33% of EV and lower running costs. This is consistent with TAG. And then it looked at two scenarios, one for doubling the EV up to 66%, and the other up to 88%. So the vehicle-led decarb commons analytics scenario in TAG. Glad I wrote that bit down. Anyway, so there'd be absolutely no surprise. More EVs, less tailpipe emissions. And for the doubling, that reduced emissions over the baseline for 2040 by a further 30%. And for the 88% scenario, it reduced it down to 56%. It still leaves a residual, and that's largely related to HGVs, which we're not talking about in this presentation. However, the really interesting thing that came out of it was an unexpected insight, and that was that there was a shift from active travel to use of car in the 2 to 5 kilometre range. It's only a few percent, but it does add quite a few vehicle kilometres, and you need to assess actually what does that mean in terms of localised congestion. So it makes you wonder what other behaviour associated with an EV future should we be thinking about. The model also enables us, following all these different attempts at getting their perfect day, to look at where they failed to take a sustainable option. And that was very useful, because what it does is enable you to see, well, actually, is it that they were very close, but it wasn't the return bus journey, or it was the timing of certain services. And what that analysis showed was actually walking and bus use provide the closest utility to a car, which suggests that we should really be looking at if we're looking at delivering modal shift going forward. Also related to behaviour, again in the news recently, there was an article saying that women are more reluctant to buy EVs than men. And this makes you wonder, or gives you a feeling that understanding people's behaviour at all stages of the EV future process is important. So behaviour when switching to EVs, you're going to get second-hand cars if people are buying them new. Charging, what is it that people need to do to be able to charge, where, how frequently? I mean, I'd guess that a number of people in this room have probably 10 plus preferences for how they charge their phone, for example. So it's likely to be a lot of nuances around that. And also driving. So as the insight showed, a shift to car from active travel, is this due to the fact that it's cheaper, or is it actually that people are guilt-free? They have an EV, they don't feel that they have any need to cut down on their driving because they're not emitting emissions. So in terms of what next, and covering off what Richard said, across different regions, what, where, and when is covered by the EV Ready tool, and it provides a really consistent approach across geography But it also, as any tool, needs to be used with local insight, particularly in looking at equitable approach. The Elvis report highlights a number of challenges, but these aren't local, maybe regional, but probably actually national. And then behaviour, Bertie and other presentations today show how important it is to understand behaviour if we're going to be effective in changing how people travel. So the switch to EV is a start, only deals with tailpipe emissions. So when do we start considering whole life implications of an EV choice? And an EV car is a car. I mean, I use these images a lot here. And so fuel is not the only solution. We do need mode shift, and this is recognised in the TDP. And finally, people don't travel to town, city, district-driven county boundaries. So why should we assess their needs on that basis? And this really does emphasise the need for a regional approach if we're going to identify and address challenges for a decarbonised future. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think we're going to move
Oh, excellent.
quickly on to Barrett. Okay, if you want to turn to your seat. Yeah, definitely got the best acronyms there. I mean, Elvis, how did I miss that one? Crikey. And even Bertie, that's fantastic. You know, a message coming through, and it was talked about earlier, providing good access to land, energy, and skills. Something extra you added there, Suzanne. So we move on to our third panellist now, who is Barrett Patania, the Technology and Innovation Lead at Midlands Connect. Barrett's role includes developing and delivering strategies and programmes across a broad portfolio of transport technologies in the Midlands. Barrett, I know how complicated your technology, digital and alternative fuel solutions are. I really do. How can we rapidly deliver at scale and without leaving anyone behind? If you want to come to lectern.
Thank you, Richard. So, first of all, thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. I can see after lunch there's still a good audience, so definitely we're doing something right here. So, before I answer that, Richard, there's a whole journey that we took to help local authorities to accelerate the EV charging infrastructure in Midlands. And where we started our journey was from the kind of the gap analysis we did across the region to understand that what our local authorities exactly wanted, what are the kind of the technologies they want to look at. So when we analyze this, in the top 5 you can clearly see EV infrastructure technology came as one of the top 5. I can't be sticking because another one closer to my heart, but I'm not talking about that today. But EV came up, and we thought, why don't we go ahead and work on our regional EV infrastructure strategy? So we looked at various work streams into this, look at the charging standards, look at the baseline forecast, and we published this work on our website in Supercharging the Midlands. And since then, quite a lot have changed. When we recently did this work in 2023, this year, about a couple of months ago, when we looked at the Midlands, the EVs we're expecting in the Midlands, the forecast said about 500,000 EVs would be on the road by 2025, and about 2 million EVs by 2030. And when we did the EV forecast in the initial work, we estimated about 39,000 EV charge points needed. But when we revisited that in 2022, it came up to 41,000, and when we revisited recently, it came about 65,000. So you can clearly see from those graphs it's been changing every year, every time we have been doing this, because this is the kind of the new norm, and this is the way to tackle decarbonization. As part of the work, when we looked at, again, you need many things in place to deliver this kind of challenge. You need to plan ahead. You have to work on the grid capacity challenges. You have to work on the optimal models for delivery. You have to put right monitoring and evaluation in place. You have to collaborate and coordinate with your stakeholders. And also you have to be ahead on the risk for the technology and the uncertainty around it. So there's a lot to think when we talk about the delivery of EV charge points. And that's where when we start to tackle the challenge, we came up with a concept. Let's work on a kind of a business case model. If we can bring the urban, rural, and kind of the suburban authorities together, what does that business case look like? What does that economies of scale look like? Because as an STB, we have a gift of multiple local authorities under our remit, so we can create those commercial models and create those procurements that will attract the supply market. And at the same time, the Levi pilot announcement came through. So we already had the business case ready. We worked on a Midlands consortium with Lincolnshire as the lead authority and Herefordshire, Stoke, Rutland, and Leicestershire as our stakeholders. We went towards this bid. Our innovation was supported by this bid. The innovation was we're bringing the group of local authorities together, and we got £1 million of funding, which is kind of delivering about more than 349 charge point sockets in these local authorities. And what role we took there as an STB is the central program management role, the site selection, the soft market testing, the DNO engagement, the charge point operators engagement, the planning, the tender specification. There's quite a lot to be done there. And as an STB, we thought that was our remit to guide this, because one of the biggest challenge that local authorities face in the region is the capability and skill set gap. So that was the Levi pilot. From the pilot, we kept working on our regional business case work, and that pilot helped us to put the lessons learned into our business case thinking. With the recent announcement of the Levi funding, which is about £66 million to be allocated within the Midlands for the EV infrastructure, we engaged with the local authorities as part of our business case work with Midlands Net Zero Hub. We approached about 18 LTAs, local transport authorities, and 10 came forward to us. Yes, we want to work on that regional business case idea. Being the regional business case, what does that mean? That how can we bring that economies of scale, procurement, the common standards of charge points, common payment standards of charge points, how can we bring all that together under one umbrella? At the moment, with this 10 local authorities consortium, it's talking about 41% of this Midlands allocated Levi funding to be part of this business case thinking. And based on the current financial modeling, what it's looking like with that 18% public funding, we can bring about 82% of the private EV charge point investment from the charge point operators. So next steps on the EV journey, we want to learn from our Levi pilot. There's quite to learn. I've created the table on the right-hand side. When we did the initial Levi pilot bid, it's been about a year since then. We are about to go on procurement in a month's time. But a lot has changed, so we have to go back onto the market, redo the soft market testing, redo the DNO engagement. We do all that modeling again to understand, has anything changed in this market? Can we still get within that 1 million about 350 charge points? Or is the number lower or more or whatever that is? There's a huge impact because of the pre-election period, so that has impacted the delivery. Also, as the lead authority, Lincolnshire, we did not expect the additional legal cost and the governance cost and the procurement cost. So these adds to your timeline. There's quite a lot to be done under tight timescales. This has led to a better regional kind of the relationship, but still the LTAs have that capability and capacity challenge, and there's one officer doing multiple jobs, and we see that all across this. So with this Levi recent announcement, we are now working on 2 tranches of work. So tranche 1 going to look at the November submission. We have already submitted the expression of interest with these consortiums, and level 2 is also looking at for the end of this financial year. So these are 2 consortiums, again, going to be led by a common local authority. We'll be there helping them with the procurement, the tender, the kind of the help needed in terms of the soft market testing, the DNO engagement, and all this kind of the financial modeling and developing those business cases. We want to input into the DFT, Levi body, OZEV. We want those lessons learned to be shared. And somewhere down the line, I think the Levi pilot gave us that innovation that now even the Levi body is saying that bring the consortiums together, bring the local authorities together for the better modeling and better business cases. We want to think beyond 2030. We want to work with other investment opportunities, or if there's other models that can be explored. For example, working with Crown Commercial Services, working with infrastructure, UK Infrastructure Bank, or Motability Scheme to see that how these can be embedded into our thinking, the business case thinking. We are planning to set up EV forums, and there should be a conference at the end of this year that we are planning to organize on EV as well. And we want to share the lessons learned from this throughout our Center of Excellence program. But last but not the least, don't underestimate the effort into this. It takes a lot of effort and hard work to get this partnership working with that governance and tight timescales, and that's why we have lovely people in our team like Heather, who is working day and night on these partnerships, and to make sure that all the consortium are thought together, everyone is thinking along the same lines, because there's a lot of internal processes that need to be dealt. But I think this is the first time through this, we will be touching something which is tangible in terms of delivery, in terms of something out on the ground with the local authorities. So we are really excited about this, but I think that comes to an end from our presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Barrett. The speed you've had to go at to get to what is a final business case, in effect, and the consortiums. I mean, I'm a long-term planner, so to see final business cases is amazing. It sounds like, you know, you may have had to make a few compromises on the way. I don't know. I know the collaborations have been, a lot of energy has gone into that. How can we make sure that the quality of the charge points are maintained? In fact, are continually improved to keep up with emerging technologies?
I think before we answer that, I see this as a three-step process. The first is the kind of the planning bit, and then the development bit, and then the delivery bit. So in planning, as I said, probably you have to work with the STBs, work with the local authorities to understand where the infrastructure is going, what type of infrastructure is needed, what procurement route you want to do. Do you want to go through Oxford DPS frameworks and things like that? Then becomes the development, which is the business case bit. And at that stage, it's very important to understand that local, urban to rural commercial model, because that's where the gift we have. With our urban local authorities, we can bring that commercial case of urban versus rural and bring them together to get a better offering and kind of offset the low commercial sites with better commercial sites. And the last bit, which is the question you're asking, is the delivery. And at the delivery point, you have to look at kind of the optimum delivery model. And also with them, you have to look at the data. Data is key into this. And also looking at probably the kind of the future-proofing the sites and the infrastructure, how you can input other technologies whenever this site is ready, and also looking at the right monitoring and evaluation. So I think if you bundle all this together, probably you can be ahead of that.
Okay, thank you, Barrett.
Thank you.
So we've come to getting towards the end now, guys. We've had some great questions on Slido, by the way. Questions around the engagement with the supply chain, around moving to more innovative funding with a new public-private relationship in that area. People talking about financial support and incentives to encourage mode split. And I think that we talked a lot earlier about having more choices and making the preferred option the easiest choice. And I think that really feeds into that behavioural change mechanisms that we know about. We've had a comment around embedded carbon versus tailpipe, and to be honest, it's all important. We've got, the SDBs have got a finite set of money and people, and so we have to choose priorities. So we did, a few years ago, decide to have a go at the tailpipe first, but all of it's really important, of course. And a comment around the wider collaborations, cross-sector collaborations that are needed for grid connections to make sure that side works as well. I'm just going to pick two questions out, and I'm going to answer them quickly because we've actually run out of time, and I can see other people coming in the audience into the back of the theatre now. So somebody asked what should be the role of government, subnational transport, in developing a national hydrogen supply infrastructure. And to be honest, with our alternative fuel site selection, we're working with the gas networks. We work a lot with Cadent Gas in the Midlands, and trying to map out what their plans are, and then ultimately to use that as an overlay to try and help decision makers. And then the final piece is around, is it's actually easier for a lorry load to simply transfer their load onto a newly charged vehicle rather than waiting to charge. Right, well, that's quite interesting, actually, because we had on our list of ways to keep the battery as an optimal size was battery swap catenary, whether that's above or below, or hydrogen fuel cell, and we've now got a fourth, actually just transferred to another lorry. So thank you for that comment. We have come to the end of the session, guys, and people are filtering through for the next session. So if you could just thank the panelists in the usual way, please.